Why would we put Franta Belsky and Winston Churchill on a first-name basis? These two keenly determined men stood face to face in 1940. Churchill, the recently appointed British Prime Minister, was inspecting Czech soldiers who had been evacuated to Britain. Franta Belsky was one of them. He recalled the moment in a 1971 interview.
And one day, Winston Churchill came. He reviewed the troops in an entirely different manner, in a very unconventional manner. He just cut right through all the red tape, and when we were lined up for some ceremony, something very formal, he ignored it completely. And he started a little walk around a huge field in which we were lined up, and he stopped in front of every soldier, looked him deep in the eye, as if he were hypnotizing him to some renewed effort, drilling his eyes into the soldier's eyes, studying his innards, stepping sideways to the next one, hunched forward, leaning on his stick, side-stepping from soldier to soldier, and so he came to me, and it seemed just ages he spent looking at me and me looking at him. And it was a very inspiring and thrilling experience. I thought now this would be a very nice project to toy with in one's mind, and one day perhaps I'll make a statue of this man who deserves to be recorded for posterity as well as I can, looking the way I saw him look on that day.
This is the story of how that moment in time between Franta and Winston came to endure in bronze. On the day of that meeting, Belsky was 19 years old and already a prize-winning art student. He had lived to witness at close hand Churchill's forecast of the Nazi threat borne out.
There is a nation which has abandoned all its liberties in order to augment its collective strength. There is a nation which, with all its strength and virtue, is in the grip of a group of ruthless men preaching a gospel of intolerance and racial pride, unrestrained by law, by parliament, or by public opinion.
When the Belsky family fled the German occupation of Prague, it was a narrow escape.
My father had a warrant for his arrest issued, and he just made it in the nick of time.
After arriving in England, Belsky volunteered for the Czechoslovak army and was sent to France. He was a gunner with a horse-drawn artillery unit. When France fell, his division was stranded on the Mediterranean coast. It could have been a death sentence. The Germans considered the Czech forces to be traitors. They would not be taken as prisoners of war. A boat redirected by Churchill rescued Belsky and the rest of his division from the south of France.
We were saved by Winston Churchill's order to a number of ships plying the Mediterranean to pick us up. I was put onto a boat called the Northmore, still half full of its cargo of coal, with about 1,700 other soldiers. There was accommodation for 11 crew, so you can imagine the cramped and somewhat uncomfortable conditions in which we found ourselves for the next 8 days before we reached Gibraltar.
The Czechs boarded a new ship in Gibraltar. This one, a luxury liner, made it to England and were stationed in Warwickshire, setting up Belsky's indelible first encounter with Churchill. Belsky and his Czech division would return to France in the 1944 invasion of Normandy. He served under Britain's Field Marshal Montgomery and America's George Patton. He was again a gunner in the artillery, receiving many decorations for bravery, including the Czech Order of Merit for staying at his position, repairing a telephone line while under heavy enemy fire. Belsky returned to Prague after the war. There he found that 22 of his Jewish relations on his father's side had perished in the Holocaust. Again, Churchill touched his life. Belsky would recall his admiration and gratitude when Churchill opposed Joseph Stalin's plan to divide post-war Europe. Churchill was, in Belsky's words, our champion. Despite Churchill, Stalin prevailed and Europe was divided. And in 1946, Churchill would again presage the course of Belsky's life.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia.
Belsky, who was already established as a sculptor in Prague, would flee Czechoslovakia in 1948, just before Stalin's communist takeover brought the curtain down. He was a fugitive again for the third time in 9 years. He arrived in England, this time with his English wife, Margaret, who he had married during the war. Belsky would not flee again. He settled in London, became a naturalized British citizen, and went on to graduate with honors from the Royal College of Art. Working from the Pembroke Studios in London, and later from his home in the village of Sutton Courtenay near Oxford, Belsky's post-war career went into full swing. Over the next half-century, he was never without a commission. He produced figurative works, statues, busts, coins and medals, and he produced abstract works. He produced works that felt both figural and abstracted. He produced works that were inspired by nature, works that were inspired by antiquity. He modeled fountains. He produced reliefs. He produced commercial decoration. He worked on a monumental scale. On a human scale, and in miniature. Over the course of 50 years, he placed 15 monumental public pieces in London alone, and 5 pieces in London's National Portrait Gallery. No matter what manner, scale, or purpose, all Belsky's public works share a common trait. Belsky wanted his sculpture to reside within a social context for real, living environments. Each of his public works is designed for a specific place and for the people at that place. In his words, he would fashion a statement of the human touch that could act as a foil to the cold logic of its surroundings. His work would be a relief to the eye and for the soul. Although Belsky was a multiple prize-winning artist early in his career, 3 events brought him to the fore. The first was his modeling of Lesson in 1957. The second was Joyride, 1958. These demonstrated not only his artistry, but also his belief that sculpture is for the delight of the general public. The third event was in 1962 when he was chosen to create a model of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. He went on to model 4 generations of the royal family, including the Queen, and became a beloved figure at Buckingham Palace. And all the while, in the back of his mind, Franta harbored the Churchill project he imagined during the war.
I put it down on paper, as I very often do when I'm clarifying thoughts about the sculpture, what this figure of Churchill should look like, what it should express. And at some time, the shapes take over, and you just worry about it as a piece of sculpture. And so soon I started thinking about this sort of big back leaning forward. and a head, this sort of bull-like thrust forward, staring away. And I hoped I'd be able to do this sculpture for a site where he'd be on the edge of something, rather like on the edge of a cliff. I've made a study which was quite elaborated, highly developed in 1953, 1954.
By the mid-60s, Belsky was in the prime of his career. Still, he was little known on the other side of the Atlantic. When he learned that a memorial to Winston Churchill was planned at Westminster College, Belsky sent a letter to the school. The letter found its way to Patrick Horsbrew, at that time the planning consultant for the Westminster project. Although Horsbrew championed Belsky, any decision on a statue commission would be postponed until after the Wren Church was near completion. By the time that day arrived 5 years later, Belsky wasn't the only artist in line. The Churchill Statue Commission was highly sought. Famed actor Douglas Fairbanks Jr. was a devoted supporter of the Westminster project. He had served with the Earl Mountbatten in World War II and was familiar with the royal family and knew of Belsky. He sent a letter to Memorial Project Manager Steve Stinson, pointing the search back to Belsky. And the search ended there. In 1968, discussions between Belsky and Westminster were underway. Neil S. Wood, chairman of the Memorial Reconstruction Committee, met Belsky in London. St. Mary Aldermanbury was dedicated in May 1969. Later that summer, Belsky visited Fulton for the first time. By that time, Mr. and Mrs. Clark R. Gamble of St. Louis had agreed to sponsor the statue. Gamble, former president and chairman of the Brown Shoe Company, was a Westminster trustee and an early supporter of the memorial project. While in Fulton, Belsky met Gamble and received the commission for the statue. It was now time to select the site where the statue would stand. Two sites were widely preferred by Neil Wood's committee. The first was in the open space between the church and Champ Auditorium, where Breakthrough by Edwina Sands, a piece formed from sections of the Berlin Wall, now stands. The second was near the entrance to the Undercroft, where a large-scale relief of Churchill delivering the Iron Curtain speech, executed by Don Wiegand of St. Louis, now stands. For this project, Belsky would put aside his customary practice of incorporating the setting for the sculpture into his design. He knew what he wanted to sculpt. He just had to find a place to put it. He looked at St. Mary Aldermanbury and found the cliffside he had imagined years before.
Within minutes of seeing the surrounding of the Church of St. Mary's, I've known that there's one site which is an absolute natural, and that however hard one tries, one can't improve on it, and that is the place where the statue stands today. Because had it been put, as some people wanted it, at an intersection of central axes between the church and the auditorium, it would have been an isolated occurrence. It would have required to be much larger and a much higher plinth, and it would simply have been a repetition of so many other effigies of city fathers, of public worthies, just a monolith. And I felt that this should have much more meaning if it were in the, so to speak, gravitational field of the church, which is the heart of the memorial. If there were some kind of invisible umbilical cord tying the two together. But then you've got this bank, 9-foot bank. It was just like made for it. It was a symbolic cliff. You could get a variety of viewing angles. You could walk up towards it. watch it approach, watch it change its stance, where it acted as a kind of finial to the long horizontal of the podium. There was just nothing wrong with this selection. To my mind, I felt utterly convinced that this is the one and only one. And to my great personal gratification, this is where it stands.
In order to sell the idea, Belsky provided a full-size silhouette of the statue to demonstrate the drama of the position. The committee said yes. A contract followed. The $25,440 price would be about $180,000 in 2021 dollars. And now to work. The questions now were logistic. Churchill, who had given the Westminster project his blessing, died in 1965. For Belsky, a portrait sculpture that is posthumous was incomparably more difficult. It requires research, compiling photographs, and making a kind of 3D identikit. Fortunately, Belsky had prepared over the years for a moment that was never guaranteed to arrive.
I have been collecting pictures. I went to see Churchill whenever I could, of course, just as an onlooker.
He began with the head portion. He had done several previous studies. Belsky adapted his original design to the new Fulton site.
I decided to make him lean forward a little bit more and make the drapery even more wind-blown. This feeling of his standing facing adversity could have been successfully expressed sculpturally by having drapery flying backward with the cloth pressed against the knees and chest. So this, I thought, should be accentuated, and I began by making a life study. I interviewed 4 or 5 male models and found a man who never posed before, but who was absolutely suitable. And just the right proportions, and he took the pose very well and gave me a chance to make a nude study. Now this is something which perhaps sculptors don't always make when they are making a closed study, but it's well worth it. It gives a much more authentic final appearance. So after I've made this nude study, I made small versions of this nude study and started putting bits of muslin on it and studying the effects of drapery. I made about 6 drapery studies, and when I had something good in every one of them, I made another one where I just telescoped it all together. Finally dressed another cast of the nude study, reworked that, cast it, and considered this as a pretty reliable basis for going on the stage of making it full scale. I submitted this obviously to my clients for approval, which I obtained.
Belsky then reproduced the site conditions in his Pembroke studio, an airy 2-story room illuminated by skylights. He designed a stand that was as high as the Westminster plinth and attached it to a massive turntable. The clay would be hung on a wire mesh covered with sheets of polystyrene.
And I've then started making an armature, which is a sort of skeleton of steel and aluminium rods and chicken wire and all kinds of timber supports. I constructed a base which was 5 foot high. Bit by bit I laid on up to 3/4 of a ton of clay.
The clay had to be sprayed constantly during the workday and covered in plastic overnight in order to stay moist and pliable.
If you put an 8-foot figure on top of this 5-foot base, you get something pretty high, which requires a scaffolding. If you've got to work from various stages and keep bringing up your material and keep going down to judge your work from the other side of the studio, it just involves you in a considerable amount of extra physical work. Also mental concentration. You see something from one side of the studio, you walk across, keeping your eyes onto one particular area of the job. By the time you've climbed 10 feet, grabbed blindly a lump of clay with one hand, a tool with the other hand, and hang onto the ladder with the skin of your teeth. By the time you get up to the top, you're as likely as not you've forgotten what you wanted to do and come down again, start from scratch. So it just magnifies your effort. But I knew that I'm going to get sightlines and perspectives very much more corresponding the final ones on the site, and therefore I shall be working less in a vacuum and more specifically to the conditions on the site.
The work consumed Belsky.
I would say to myself that I've just got to take some time off and go out. And I'd round the corner and I'd start wondering, what the hell am I doing walking the streets, looking at shops, if I've got this to do at home? And 5 minutes later, I'd be back.
By the summer of 1970, the statue had acquired what Belsky called volume and personality. Here, the accuracy of scale may or may not satisfy the needs of the eye. Even on a life-and-half scale, a quarter of an inch miscalculation can sometimes throw a figure off balance. In other cases, deliberate scale adjustments are required to fool the eye. An arm silhouetted against the sky had to be made slightly heavier, a practice used since the early Greeks. The hat and hand, though, had to be several sizes too small in order to work within the perspective. And then it was time for attention to detail and authenticity, such as the dotted bow tie and the watch chain through the buttonhole. The full-scale clay model was approved and ready for casting in fall 1970. It was delivered to the Meridian Bronze Company in London. This was Belsky's preferred foundry throughout his career. The statue would be cast in bronze using the lost wax process, a method unchanged since antiquity. In this method, the clay model is cast in pieces: arms, legs, torso, head. Wax forms of the pieces are made from the casts. Belsky had a method of bringing this wax surface into relief by brushing it with a fine bronze dust. He made adjustments to the surface using steel tools heated with a flame. He is shown here using the technique on a later Churchill bust. The trap wax is melted or lost, leaving a thin open layer for the bronze to be poured. The dramatic moment arrives when the bronze is set, the mold is broken, and the final casting is revealed. Here the bronze head can be seen after removal from the final mold. The angular objects protruding from the head are vents that allow gases to escape while the bronze set. These would be removed and patched. In the background of the photo, the wax mold of the leg and hat and the wax mold of the torso can be seen awaiting their bronze casting. Belsky found the casting to be faultless, showing the most minute details. After the remaining parts of the statue were cast in bronze, they now resembled pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. Skilled foundrymen using welding and pinning joined them under Belsky's watch. The statue was cleaned in an acid solution and then polished in a process called patination to bring out the rich colors and luminosity of the bronze. And Winston was done. The final piece weighs 1,200 pounds, although it is in places only a quarter-inch thick. In January 1971, the statue was given a preview exhibition at the American Embassy in London.
The Americans really went to town. I was most impressed, really, as one heard the Americans do things.
Lady Churchill, the leader's widow, attended and gave the work her blessing. The Royal Air Force offered to fly the statue to Missouri.
Possibly the nicest flight I've ever had. This enormous VC-10, capable of carrying either, I don't know how many hundred people or so many jeeps or paratroopers, had nothing but this crate in the middle of its entirely empty fuselage. We touched down in Washington and were joined by the British air attaché from the embassy, dripping with gold braid and looking extremely smart. Went on to St. Louis.
The statue was offloaded in April and stored at the aircraft works at McDonnell Douglas, Lambert Field, St. Louis. It was exhibited briefly in the main hall of the St. Louis Art Museum before coming to Fulton on May 14th. The placing of the statue on the plinth was done in under 1 hour by the Epple Construction Company of Columbia, Missouri. Apple was the construction company that rebuilt the church.
One is really, without knowing it, very much tense and full of anxieties. It just went without a hitch. The sculpture came again exactly when it should have from St. Louis. It was grabbed by the crane, hoisted, placed on its base, the grout put into the base for holding it back, and I could see the sculpture as I imagined it, in its final position, for the first time being illuminated by the sun, casting its own shadows, with the backcloth of the church, exciting details. I could suddenly check up whether all the planning, scheming, and striving, and arguments, and fears, and hopes make up a sum total which I hope to achieve. Now, I know that when you do a sculpture in a studio, that it always looks much bigger, being boxed in by these physical limits. And that when you take it outdoors, it suddenly gets dwarfed, and you work towards it. You expect it, but you want to make it still look as bold and generous out of doors as it looks to you in the studio. In this case, I was enormously gratified to feel that none of this happened, that it didn't lose by being out of doors. It just seemed to have enough stuffing to stand this rigorous test.
The May 16th unveiling was, Belsky recalled, a perfect Midwestern spring day. Here, Samuel C. Stout, the British Consul General, speaks before turning the podium over to the former president of Westminster, Dr. Frank L. McClure. Dr. McClure, who had invited Churchill to Fulton for that now famous day 25 years earlier, gave the address to 700 guests and a crowd of onlookers. It included the reading of letters from Presidents Truman, Johnson, and Nixon. Mr. and Mrs. Gamble, with a little help from Westminster Vice President Virgil Johnston, yanked a cord, and Winston was revealed.
It should depict him as he was at the zenith of his life, and this is what the figure should express, that it should be determined, it should stand four square, it should show his personal determination, but just as his speeches have an element of cheerfulness, confidence. I myself, I just see no reason why I shouldn't say it, felt that I've completed my task 100%. I was extremely relieved. I just felt like, I suppose, like a mother must feel when it gives birth to a child, all drained, absolutely washed out, just feeling that it's come to this conclusion in ripeness of time, and that's all.
Franta Belsky was tall, raw-boned, strong, and athletic. He was a daring alpine skier. He could be stubborn. He refused to work with galleries and dealers. He could be idiosyncratic. He never sought or wanted one-man exhibitions. He could be tender. His studio was full of music, each piece chosen for its effect on his work. His mind was always on. If he met someone who made an impression on him, he could later recall that person's eye color. His home in Sutton Courtenay, 57 miles west of London, was a thatched cottage surrounded by 30 different species of roses that Franta cultivated. The interior was decorated with his own work and that of his old friend, famed artist Ronald Searle, and the drawings of his first wife, Margaret. He called her Cooey. His devotion was constant and romantic. She was a successful cartoonist in her own right who became ever more camera-shy as her fame grew. He disliked not having her near and sent handwritten letters daily when apart. 7 years after her death in 1989, he married fellow sculptor Irena Sidleka. Belsky's physical strength was evident in his art. His public works are never muted, and they became the heartbeat of their surroundings wherever they were placed. For Belsky, capturing a likeness in clay was simply a matter of artistic competence. He wanted more. He would put himself into the work, or in his words, the marks of the fingernails, the grip of the hand, to imbue the clay with humanity. His modeling of heads, especially of children, reveals extraordinary warmth and sensitivity. It also reveals an instinct for judging character. Belsky's combination of sensitivity and strength, plus his gift for reading people, reached new heights in his depiction of Churchill.
He's just a sort of Julius Caesar of modern times, a man of enormous imagination and drive, a man who can write, who can speak, and who can think.
He completed 4 Churchills in his career, including 2 life-scale busts and 1 monumental scale bust. But it was the Fulton statue, 30 years in the making, that reached the pinnacle. The work was removed from view in the summer of 2020 in order to undergo conservation treatment and restore the original patina. The conservation treatment offered an opportunity to explore a Belsky quirk. He was known for placing a Guinness bottle inside his sculptures just before they were mounted. For his first American statue, he switched to a bourbon bottle. As was his custom, the bottle contained the front page from that day's newspaper, a coin of that year, and a note stating that he was the sculptor who commissioned it, and at what price. Winston will return to his post in 2021, the 75th anniversary year of the Iron Curtain speech. The bronze masterpiece will once again stand watch at America's National Churchill Museum.